That was Commissioner Joshua Simmons. And in that moment, he said more about who Nancy was than anything else ever could. She was 38 years old, and on the edge of something bigger than anything she had ever done before. Inside her home, everything was set. In just a few hours, she was expected to step forward and make an announcement that could take her from local leadership to the national stage.
Good evening, Coral Springs. I am your Vice Mayor, Nancy Metayer Bowen, but before I begin my remarks, I would like to acknowledge my parents.
Because this wasn't just anyone. She had already made history, becoming the first Black Haitian American woman to rise into leadership as a Vice Mayor of Coral Springs, Florida. A voice for her community. A woman people believed in. A woman who had worked her way into rooms that weren't built for people like her. And now, she was about to take it even further. But that moment never came. Because while the world was waiting to hear her next move, someone inside that home already knew she wasn't going anywhere. Before we get to that, you need to know who Nancy Metayer Bowen was, then a title. Before we get into this, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles for more stories like this. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Nancy Metayer Bowen was 38 years old, but the life she had built already carried the weight of decades of purpose. She wasn't the kind of person who drifted into leadership. Everything about her path was intentional. From the way she spoke to the way she carried herself, there was a sense that she knew exactly why she was in the room she entered, and what she was there to change. Her story began in a Haitian American household, where values like discipline, education, and service weren't optional, they were expected. Being a first-generation American shaped how she saw the world. It wasn't just about success, it was about responsibility. About representing something bigger than herself. Education became one of her first stepping stones. Nancy pursued her studies with focus, eventually earning a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. That choice alone said a lot about who she was. She wasn't chasing attention. She was chasing impact. Public health meant people, systems, communities. It meant solving real problems that affected everyday lives. But she didn't stop at theory. She stepped into spaces where decisions were made. Early in her career, she gained experience through national-level work, including time connected to federal agencies and political environments. Those experiences sharpened her understanding of policy, leadership, and how change actually happens, not just in conversations, but in action. Still, she chose to return to her community. In Coral Springs, Florida, Nancy began building something tangible. She worked within Broward County, contributing to programs that focused on improving quality of life for residents. But it quickly became clear that she wasn't meant to stay behind the scenes. She had a voice, and people listened. In 2020, she ran for office. And when she won, it wasn't just a personal achievement. Nancy became the first Black Haitian American woman elected to the Coral Springs City Commission. That moment carried weight, not just politically, but culturally. It meant representation. It meant visibility. It meant that young people who look like her could now see themselves in positions of leadership. But she didn't treat it like a title. She treated it like a responsibility. Nancy showed up, she engaged with residents, she pushed conversations forward. Whether it was community development, environmental concerns, or public health initiatives, she approached each issue with the same mindset: listen first, act with purpose. By 2024, she had earned enough trust and respect to be re-elected. Soon after, she stepped into the role of vice mayor. It was another step forward, but not a surprising one. For many, it felt like a natural progression. Colleagues saw her as focused, someone who prepared, who paid attention to detail, who didn't take shortcuts. Friends described her as grounded, someone who never lost sight of where she came from. And for many in the community, she wasn't just a public official. She was someone they could trust to speak for them. And it's what made her stand out. Nancy wasn't just building a career, she was building momentum. By the time Nancy Metayer Bowen stepped into the role of vice mayor, she was no longer just a rising name. She was becoming a central figure in the future of her city. The position wasn't ceremonial. In Coral Springs, the vice mayor plays a visible leadership role, working closely with the city commission, helping guide decisions, and representing the city in key moments. Nancy embraced that responsibility fully. She didn't treat the role as a stepping stone. She treated it as an opportunity to prove what leadership could look like when it was rooted in service. Her work in the community reflected that. She stayed connected to the people who had put her there, attending meetings, engaging with residents, and addressing real concerns. Whether it involved environmental issues, public health priorities, or local development, she approached each situation with clarity and preparation. She listened carefully, then spoke with purpose, and people noticed. At the same time, her influence was expanding beyond city limits. Nancy had taken on a larger role within the Democratic Party in Florida, serving as vice chair. That position placed her in a broader political network, where she worked on outreach, engagement, and strengthening connections, especially within Haitian American communities. She understood the importance of representation, not just at the local level, but across the state and beyond. She wasn't just participating in politics anymore. She was helping shape it. Those who worked around her began to recognize a shift. Her voice carried more weight, her ideas reached further, and the conversations she was part of started to move beyond city concerns into something bigger. That's when the idea of a congressional run began to take shape. It wasn't announced publicly yet, but it was no secret within her circle that Nancy was preparing for something more. The path was clear. She had the experience, the credibility, and the support. Moving from vice mayor to a seat in Congress wasn't just ambition. It was a realistic next step. For Nancy, it represented more than a political advancement. It was the next phase of her purpose, a chance to take everything she had built locally and expand it to a national level. A chance to represent not just a city, but a broader community whose voices often went unheard. Everything in her life seemed aligned with that moment. Her experience, her leadership, her growing influence. It all pointed forward. But as her career was rising, something else was quietly unraveling behind the scenes. Away from city meetings, public appearances, and the steady pace of political life, Nancy Metayer Bowen had another world. One that very few people ever saw in full. She was married to Stephen Bowen. To the outside world, their relationship appeared normal. There were no widely known public disputes, no viral arguments, no obvious signs that anything was deeply wrong. From what people could see, they were a couple building a life together while Nancy's career continued to grow. And that's what made everything that followed so difficult to understand. Their life together seemed steady on the surface. Nancy was focused, driven, constantly balancing responsibilities. Her schedule was demanding, her role in the community growing, and her involvement in politics expanding beyond the local level. It required time, attention, and energy, things that can quietly reshape the dynamics inside a home. But what that looked like behind closed doors wasn't something the public had access to. There are moments in relationships that never make it outside, conversations that stay within walls, tension that doesn't show up in photos or public interactions. And in this case, there's no confirmed record of ongoing conflict that others could point to and say, this was the turning point. That absence of visible warning signs is what makes this part of the story so unsettling. Because it leaves a gap between what people believed was happening and what actually was. On one side, there was Nancy's public life. A woman respected in her community. A leader who had earned her position. Someone preparing for what could have been the biggest step in her career. She was visible, active, and admired. Her life looked structured, purposeful, and on track. On the other side, there was her private life. Less visible, less understood. A space where the details weren't shared publicly, where emotions and pressures, if they existed, remained inside the home. A space that didn't come with headlines or attention, but carried its own weight. And the truth is, those two worlds don't always move in the same direction. From the outside, everything can appear stable, even strong. But what's happening privately can be entirely different, and sometimes no one else is close enough to see it clearly. How does something like this happen without anyone seeing it coming? Those questions didn't have easy answers. Because sometimes, the signs aren't obvious, and sometimes the most dangerous problems are the ones no one else can see. In the days leading up to April 1st, everything in Nancy Metayer Bowen's life seemed to be moving toward a defining moment. Just months earlier, Nancy had experienced a deeply personal loss. Her younger brother, who had survived a school shooting, had died after struggling for some time. It was a tragedy that carried its own kind of heaviness. One that doesn't simply pass with time. She had spoken about him, honored him, carried that loss with her. And yet, even through that, she continued to move forward. That balance between grief and responsibility is something few people truly understand unless they've lived it. The ability to show up publicly while carrying something personal and painful in private. It requires strength, but it also adds pressure, even if that pressure isn't visible. In those final days, Nancy was holding both: a future that was opening up in front of her, and a loss that hadn't fully settled behind her. From the outside, everything still looked steady. She remained engaged, active, committed. There was no indication that anything had changed in her routine or her focus. If anything, she seemed aligned with what was ahead. But moments like these, when life is at a turning point, often come with intensity. Expectations grow, decisions matter more. Timing becomes critical, and for someone in Nancy's position, that pressure isn't just personal, it's public. People are watching, waiting, anticipating what comes next. April 1st didn't begin with panic. At first, it was just silence. Nancy Metayer Bowen wasn't answering her phone. A call came in, no response. Then another. Messages followed. Still nothing. For someone as responsive and structured as Nancy, that alone was enough to raise concern. She wasn't the kind of person who disappeared in the middle of a busy day, especially not when something important was approaching. Time passed. What started as a slight concern slowly turned into something heavier. The calls didn't stop, but neither did the silence on the other end. People who knew her began to notice the same thing at the same time. This wasn't like her. She had responsibilities, commitments, a schedule she followed closely, and on a day that carried so much weight, her absence didn't make sense. As the hours moved forward, that feeling shifted from confusion to worry. Someone decided to check on her. A welfare check was requested at her home. When officers arrived, nothing seemed immediately out of place from the outside. The house stood still. No signs of disturbance, no noise, no indication that anything unusual had happened. But the reason they were there hadn't changed. She still wasn't answering. The officers approached the door. Knocked, waited, nothing. The silence inside wasn't just quiet. It felt final. Eventually, they made their way in. And that's when everything changed. Inside, the air felt different. Still, heavy. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from interruption. From something that had already happened. Room sat untouched. No movement, no voice, no sign of her walking in or out. Just the quiet presence of a space that should have been occupied but wasn't. They moved further inside, step by step, until they reached the bedroom, and that's where they found her. Nancy Metayer Bowen was inside her own home, unresponsive. Still, her body had been placed in a way that immediately raised questions. Covered. Hidden. As if someone had tried to delay the moment she would be discovered. The scene didn't show signs of forced entry. There were no clear indicators that someone had broken in. No immediate evidence of an outside threat. Everything pointed inward. And in that moment, the situation shifted completely. What had started as concern over a missed call became the beginning of a homicide investigation. Something had happened inside that house, something deliberate. Inside that bedroom, the truth didn't take long to surface. Nancy Metayer Bowen hadn't died from natural causes. She hadn't collapsed or suffered a sudden medical emergency. She had been shot, multiple times. The injuries made that clear. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't a single moment that got out of control. The violence was direct, intentional, final. Whoever was responsible had been inside. From that point, the focus changed. Investigators weren't looking outward anymore. They were looking inward, at the people who had access to that home, at the individuals who were part of Nancy's immediate circle. And one name quickly became central. Her husband, Stephen Bowen. The details that followed didn't come from speculation. They came from statements, conversations that had already taken place before officers fully assembled the timeline. According to investigators, Stephen had contacted a family member, not to report a break-in, not to ask for help in finding Nancy, but to confess. He told his uncle what had happened. He admitted that he had shot her 3 times. That information alone changed everything. It removed uncertainty. It redirected the investigation from who to why. Because the who was no longer a question. What leads to something like this? What turns a private space, a home, into the site of something so irreversible? When Stephen spoke about what he had done, one line stood out. A line that didn't explain everything, but said just enough to leave people unsettled. I couldn't take it anymore. No long explanation, no detailed breakdown, just that. And that line sat there, unfinished. Because what does that mean? What exactly had reached a breaking point? Which left investigators and everyone else trying to understand how something so extreme could happen without a clear, visible lead-up. The physical evidence told part of the story. And the statement connected it directly to someone inside the home. But it didn't answer the deeper question. It didn't explain the moment between before and after. The point where everything changed. Because sometimes what happens inside a home doesn't leave a visible trail leading up to it. Sometimes it stays contained until it doesn't. In the hours after Nancy Metayer Bowen was found, the situation moved quickly. But for those closest to her, it felt unreal. Before officers confirmed what had happened inside the home, there had already been a call, one that would later become a key part of the timeline. A family member had reached out to 911. The concern wasn't random. It was specific. Urgent. During that call, it was revealed that Stephen Bowen had said something alarming, something that didn't sound like confusion or panic. He had admitted that he had done something to Nancy. That call shifted everything. What had started as worry over not answering her phone became something far more serious. The possibility that this wasn't just a welfare check, but something deliberate, was already forming before officers even stepped fully into the scene. Stephen Bowen was taken into custody. There was no extended search, no unknown suspect on the run. The focus of the investigation had already narrowed, and with the statements he had made, authorities had enough to act. He was arrested and formally charged. Premeditated murder. And an additional charge tied to what had been done after the act, attempting to conceal or interfere with the scene. Those charges reflected more than just the act itself. They pointed to intention, to decisions made not just in the moment, but afterward. As news of the arrest spread, the reaction was immediate. People who had worked with Nancy, people who had known her, people who had supported her, they were all trying to process the same reality at the same time. How does someone go from being part of her life to being responsible for ending it? There were no easy answers. Just a growing awareness of what had been lost, and the difficult understanding that this wasn't an outside threat that could be explained away or distanced. It had come from within her own home, within her own life, and once that truth settled in, everything else, her plans, her future, the announcement she never got to make, felt even heavier. Because the person who should have been closest to her was now the one facing charges for her death. What makes a case like this so difficult to process isn't just what happened, it's how little anyone saw coming. From the outside, Nancy Metayer Bowen's life looked stable, structured, purposeful. She was respected, admired, and moving forward. There were no public signs pointing to danger, no visible breakdown, no clear moment where everything shifted in a way others could recognize. And that's what forces a deeper question. How often do we assume everything is fine, simply because it looks that way? One of the most important themes in this case is what isn't visible. Relationships don't always reveal their full reality to the outside world. There are conversations that stay private, emotions that go unspoken, pressure that builds quietly, and sometimes that silence becomes part of the problem. Not because silence causes harm, but because it can hide it. Another layer to consider is the role of pressure. Nancy's life was moving forward in a major way. Her influence was growing, her responsibilities were expanding, and she was on the edge of something that could have taken her even further. Moments like that can bring excitement, but they can also introduce imbalance within relationships. When one person is rising quickly, it can shift dynamics in ways that aren't always openly addressed. That doesn't justify anything that happened, but it does raise important questions about how pressure expectation, and emotional strain are handled behind closed doors, because when those conversations don't happen, tension doesn't disappear. It stays. And in some cases, it builds. There's also the reality of emotional isolation. Not the kind that comes from being physically alone, but the kind where someone feels disconnected, even within a shared space. That kind of isolation doesn't always show itself outwardly. It can exist quietly, without clear signs. And when communication breaks down, even small issues can begin to carry more weight than they should. This case doesn't offer simple answers, but it does highlight something important. Everything can look normal until it isn't. And that doesn't mean people should live in fear. It means awareness matters. Checking in, paying attention, being willing to have difficult conversations before tension grows beyond control. Because sometimes the difference between stability and breakdown isn't obvious from the outside. It's hidden in the parts of life no one else sees. What do you think really happened behind closed doors? Let me know in the comments. At the beginning of this story, everything pointed toward a moment that was supposed to change Nancy Metayer Bowen's life. She was 38, a vice mayor. A woman who had already made history and was preparing to take the next step. The calls coming into her phone that day weren't random. They were people waiting, people expecting her to show up, to speak, to step forward into something bigger. She was hours away from that moment, hours away from expanding everything she had built. But that moment never came. Instead, the silence in that house told a different story. A story that didn't match the direction her life was moving in. A story that interrupted everything she had worked toward. The future she was preparing for didn't fade slowly. It stopped, without warning, inside the place she should have felt most secure. And that contrast is what makes this so difficult to sit with. On one side, there was a public future, clear, visible, full of possibility. On the other side, there was a private reality that no one fully understood until it was too late. She wasn't stepping away from anything. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't running away. She was stepping into something bigger. And that's what makes the loss feel even heavier. Because it wasn't just about who she was. It was about who she was becoming. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Stories like this aren't just about what happened, they're about understanding, awareness, and remembering the people behind the headlines. And if you haven't already, subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles for more real stories told with depth and respect. I'll see you in the next one.